Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. In his comments on Monday in London, Secretary of State John Kerry said the U.S. is not seeking war in Syria, just what he called an unbelievably small campaign of targeted strikes.
Hold Bashar Assad accountable without engaging in troops on the ground or any other prolonged kind of effort in a very limited, very targeted, a very short-term effort that degrades his capacity to deliver chemical weapons without assuming responsibility for Syria's civil war. That is exactly what we're talking about doing. Unbelievably small, limited kind of effort.
Unbelievably small, Rania Masri, professor in Lebanon, speaking to us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Does that reassure you as a person who is opposed to a U.S. strike on Syria? What could it mean?
Well, I think it's more important when we look at what has been discussed by Senator John McCain and others, and they were more talking about a 60 to 90-day bombing campaign, and even a relatively small. And what does that mean? What are the targets that they're going to consider suitable targets for their objectives, given that militarily there cannot be deterrence for the use of chemical weapons militarily, it can only be achieved politically. But I do want to say this in rebuttal to an earlier comment. I do say the so-called Free Syrian Army because it is not an army with a clear hierarchy. It is a group of independent battalions operating under the same name. Check the reports from The Economist, check the reports from Joshua Landis. I think what's absolutely clear, we're all united that we want to stop the violence in Syria. We're all united that we want to have some semblance of peace and stability. And to do that, there needs to be pressure put on all sides in Syria. Not only pressure put on the Syrian government, but pressure put on all the rebels themselves who are also committing crimes, if not working directly with the terrorists. And I think it's very important to recognize that the main financier here of these rebel brigades in Syria is Bandar bin Sultan, the previous U.S. ambassador, the previous Saudi ambassador to the United States, and he was also the prime financier of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and of the Contras in Nicaragua. This is a man with a very long track record of encouraging groups to commit crimes and to commit war crimes. And this is not a man who has supported groups that represent the people themselves. So we need to put this into perspective. And I also think that what's happening right now forces the administration and forces those in Congress to come clean. If they are concerned with chemical weapons, they have a way out very clearly without any bombs being dropped. If they are concerned with regime change in Syria, then we will see their position. And again, we all know what the U.S. means when it says regime change. It never does regime change for democracy. It does regime change for implementation of different puppets.
Rafi Shwajati, your response to Rania Masri, and on this issue of Saudi backing, among others, Wall Street Journal had a major expose on what Rania Masri was just saying, that the man in the U.S. who came to be known as Bandar Bush, the former Saudi ambassador to the United States, who famously shared a cigar with President Bush the day after the 9/11 attacks on the Truman balcony, so close to the Bush family, they nicknamed him that, that he, in the last few years, is behind much of the support of the Saudi rebels and has been pushing the U.S. to wage a military strike against the Assad regime.
I'm not going to apologize for Bandar bin Sultan. I'm not going to comment or support in any way any of the Gulf involvement in what is happening in Syria. I do want to go back to something Rania said. I do not read Joshua Landis because I make it a practice to not support regime shills and regime propagandas. So if that's the literature she's relying on for her information, that's really unfortunate. But let me go on and answer the specific question you asked, Amy, and that was about John Kerry's statements and I guess sort of the movement of this very limited strike. And let me be clear, the LCC does not support a limited strike. As John Kerry said, this would be unbelievably small, and we don't believe that an unbelievably small response is going to do anything to an unbelievably brutal dictator that is destroying the country, that is destroying civil society, that in fact has been the one to open the doors for the jihadists, that in fact is the one using chemical weapons against its own civilians.
You know,
Let me ask you something, Rafif. Rania Masri, just one second. I want to ask Rafif, if war was not on the table, I mean, if a U.S. strike was not on the table, what do you think is a diplomatic solution to this incredibly bloody conflict?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure there is a clear-cut answer. We have a fundamental problem in that one of the parties that consistently vetoes any language in the UN also supplies weapons to the Assad regime. This is a major problem. We have the problem of Gulf countries supplying weapons to haphazard battalions on the ground, independent of the Free Syrian Army. So I'm not sure what the diplomatic answer is. The other thing to consider is that, as I began with, 18 months ago, when there were international initiatives, diplomatic initiatives on the table to stop the violence, the Assad regime failed to adhere to a single tenet of the peace plans that were put forward. So we always welcome a diplomatic solution. Of course, this should be a political resolution. But how?
Well, Rania Masri, what about this issue? What do you think is a possible solution?
Well, first I want to say I find it not only criminal but also ahistoric to imagine that a U.S. bombing campaign lobbied against Syria or any other country would actually result in something humanitarian or something peaceful or something stable. Simply study history. Start with studying history. Look at Iraq. Look at no, let me finish. Look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan. Look at all others. I find it absolutely abhorrent that we would actually be calling for a larger than a limited military strike on Syria. One. Part two, we need to recognize, and I have to continue to repeating this, yes, the Syrian army has committed crimes, but so has the so-called Free Syrian Army and the terrorists that they work with. And don't just quote me on that or Joshua Landis, but quote the United Nations. When we have a UN independent panel that was released, they released a report earlier this year in which they said, and I quote, "It's impossible to choose good guys among the groups of Syrian rebels and send weapons to them." I think we need to stand clear here and say no to violence committed by any party. And to do that, there is a very strong political solution. The United States can put pressure on its allies in the region, namely the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks, to halt the flood of weapons that's coming in from Sudan and Libya via Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan to these rebels. Halt that. Push the Russians to then put pressure on the Syrians. Get the Syrians themselves to the negotiating table. We all agree that the only solution can be a political settlement. Kerry has said so. Secretary of Defense Hagel had said so. Any bombing campaign will only result in reducing whatever political capital there is in providing that political settlement, will only give power to extremism on all sides in Syria, and will only kill more and more Syrians and result in more and more displacement. This is what we need to be calling for: a halt to the arms trade, stronger demand for political diplomacy, for political negotiations, increased support for humanitarian support for the Syrians, and absolutely no bombing of any kind, limited or expanded.
I want to just read this latest from CBS. The French foreign minister has said France will float a resolution at the UN Security Council aimed at forcing Syria to make public its chemical weapons program, place it under international control and dismantle it. It was unclear whether France's fresh push for a UN resolution was spawned by the Russian proposal, but the terms given seem similar. CBS is also reporting Laurent Fabius said France, a permanent member of the 15-nation UN body, would start the resolution process today. He said the proposal would be under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which would back up the resolution with a threat of force if not applied, and would condemn a chemical weapons attack in Syria on August 21st. So let's bring this full circle to where we began. Rafif, with this latest news, do you see any hope?
You know, I always have to have hope, because the people on the ground always have hope. I do want to point out to Rania that she's trying to create a debate where none exists. I'm not defending crimes perpetrated by the opposition, and I'm not condoning in any way any of their negative actions. But to come full circle, the point of a political resolution is to hope that the regime, the perpetrator of the majority of the crimes, would come to that political resolution. And I don't think the Assad regime is capable or willing to engage in any sort of political resolution that has it negotiating itself out of power.
Rania Masri, I wanted to ask you about the comments of Alon Pincus. He's the former Israeli consul general in New York. And speaking to the New York Times last week, Pincus described his take on how Israel is viewing the conflict in Syria. He said, quote, "This is a playoff situation in which you need both teams to lose, but at least you don't want one to win. We'll settle for a tie. Let them both bleed, hemorrhage to death. That's the thinking here. As long as this lingers, there's no real threat from Syria." Are you worried that that is basically the international approach to Syria right now, is let them bleed?
Well, I mean, I take issue with the term international because we do have very different state parties here. I think it is one of the objectives of the U.S. government, yes, and of course its allies, be they in Israel or be they in the Gulf, that yes, one of the objectives is to continue to have them, quote, kill each other, as was the objective of the U.S. government during the Iraq-Iran war. Yes, I do see that as being one of the objectives, the continuous destruction of Syria as a country and of its people on all sides, yes. But I also want to raise this issue. And I'm not just creating a debate for the objective of debate, but I'm actually understanding what's being said by the other party. While we sit here and we're opposed to the use of chemical weapons, and I would argue opposed to the use of all weapons, not just chemical weapons, it's important to point out that according to statements made by the United Nations itself, they've released statements that, quote, they have strong suspicion that the rebels themselves have access and have used sarin gas. And these statements were made earlier this year. So again, I just want to say that what we need to be working on is a full halt of the arms trade. Now, with regards to the French proposal, one thing that scares me as an expert to what the United States did to Iraq during the 13 years of sanctions is once we make a statement related to weapons of mass destruction, any way, shape or form, and we back it up with a threat of weapons and a threat of a bombing campaign, okay, or a threat of further economic sanctions, we know who will end up getting punished by these. And the people that will end up being punished are the people that have no voice and that are completely vulnerable, and that are the Syrian people itself. So with regards to this resolution that the French are proposing in the United Nations, I think it is wise, so long as it is not backed up by a threat of a bombing campaign. Again, we need to be unequivocal here and say absolutely no bombing campaign by anyone under any circumstances.
We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you both for being with us, but of course the conversation continues. President Obama will address the nation tonight. Tomorrow we'll spend the hour with Professor Noam Chomsky to get his response. Rania Masri is a Lebanese-based human rights activist, professor at the University of Balamand in Lebanon. She joined us from Raleigh, North Carolina. And we've been speaking with Rafif Jouajati, the English language spokesperson for the Syrian Local Coordination Committees, a network of activists throughout Syria. She's based in Washington, D.C. This is Democracy Now!